willkommen in Bern im CDB.
A studio on the outskirts of Bern in Switzerland. This is where the world-famous designer Luigi Collani works.
Das ist ein Flugzeug für den Pariser Salon, eine Motorradstudie für Goodyear.
You won't find any harsh artificial lines in Collani's designs, although he has used modern high-tech means to create their smooth curves. Collani protests that shape is the language common to all human beings. In other words, beautiful forms can be understood beyond the barriers of time and nationality.
Für Normales, das ist ein Mazda Supersportwagen für Le Mans. Dort stehen Motorräder und Flugmodelle. Das ist ein Windkanalmodell.
In this series, we hope to discover the spirit behind the many forms and designs created by the Japanese. There's a special reason for our coming to see Luigi Collani. The secret behind Collani's mysterious curved forms are to be found in nature. Inspired by the kingfisher, he's designing a new shape for a hairdryer.
Biodesign. The hand is the tool. Die Hand ist das Werkzeug.
Biodesign. What Collani means is that he's using the latest high-technology materials to model the many shapes of nature, from gems to deep-water fish. This is quite different from the highly utilitarian designs of modern Europe. Collani has been called a wizard of the curved line because of his ability to create forms freely. He has shown a great interest in the artistic forms of ancient Japan.
Das ist sehr alte japanische Kultur. Das ist schön. Außergewöhnliche dreidimensionale Formen.
An old Jomon vase has caught his imagination. So, to begin this series, we'll look at some of the oldest surviving forms fashioned by the Japanese.
Das ist magische Linie.
The Jomon period is shrouded in mystery. Thanks to radiocarbon dating, however, we know that this period began around 12,000 years ago. But what kind of people lived in Japan then? And what influence did their civilization have on the cultures of later periods? One thing is certain. It was during this period that people began to mold clay and create a variety of shapes from it. Unlike earlier periods when people seemed to have merely sharpened flint and bones, the people of the Jomon period created their own forms from lumps of clay. The making of earthenware pottery was a big revolution in the history of mankind. It is said that the Jomon period continued for about 10,000 years, and during that period, Japan remained culturally isolated. The Jomon pottery was made in various parts of this isolated archipelago. Throughout this period, more than 50 styles of pottery came and went. The first creative pottery in the Japanese archipelago, Jomon pottery. Its versatile and powerful form, which fascinates still today, was developed in an environment isolated from surrounding cultures. Is Jomon pottery in Japan the only example of such isolated development? Central America. Before this land was conquered by the Europeans, ancient civilizations flourished here for several thousand years. In particular, we have a great deal of evidence concerning the Mayan civilization in the Yucatan Peninsula. The most illustrious period was from the 7th to the 11th century AD, when a number of magnificent ziggurats were built in the Yucatan Peninsula. Despite the fact that they were able to produce such imposing buildings, the Mayan civilization managed to do this without the help of metal tools. They were still in the Neolithic, or New Stone Age. On this point, the Mayan period was similar to the Jomon period in Japan. Of the many remains of the Mayan civilization, those of Uxmal are probably among the most beautiful in form. Geometric patterns and images of the gods are carved over the entire stone wall. Shuichi Kato likes to keep foreign civilizations in mind when he studies Japanese culture. He's been invited to give lectures on Japanese culture at universities in France, Germany, the United States, Canada, Mexico, and other countries. Kato says that when he looks at Jomon pottery, the origin of Japanese artistic creation, he is reminded of the Mayan civilization. The Jomon and Mayan civilizations were separated by thousands of miles of ocean, and what's more, they existed at different periods of history. What kind of link is there between the two? Kato thinks that the two civilizations have many things in common.
The Jomon period was a time when Japan was cut off from her neighbors. It was a Neolithic civilization. There have been several other isolated Neolithic civilizations in various parts of the world, but probably the most advanced were to be found in Central America. The area we now call Mexico seems to have been the center of the new Stone Age civilizations of this area. When we look into how far the Jomon period was able to develop without the aid of outside influences, it's very useful to compare it with other similar cultures. It's interesting because I'm always reminded of the Mayan civilization of Mexico whenever I look at examples of Jomon pottery, and also the other way around. Those Mayan carvings seem to have something in common with Jomon artifacts.
The people of the Jomon period did not have a written culture. This has proved to be a big obstacle in understanding more about this civilization. The Jomon people may not have left us any written words, but perhaps we can learn something about them from the shapes of their pottery. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics of Jomon pottery. First of all, the name itself, Jomon, means rope patterns. The patterns seem to have varied with the different settlements or even different stages of that period, and they were achieved by a number of methods. The straw rope came to have a meaning of its own later on, as one of the sacred trappings of Shinto shrines. But not all these patterns were made with twined or plaited straw. For instance, this strange pattern. The Jomon people observed the countless interesting shapes in nature and discovered all sorts of novel possibilities. Those strange yet intricate patterns weren't made with artificial tools, but with objects found in nature. So it comes as no surprise to see Luigi Collani taking an interest in Jomon pottery. The Jomon people concentrated all their creative energies on producing that fascinating earthenware. But the ancient civilizations of Central America gave expression to their artistry in the form of splendid buildings and elegant reliefs. Even the Spaniards who later conquered this area were impressed by the beauty of this building and called it the Nunnery.
This building is beautiful and well thought out. Look at the position of the 5 square windows on the lower floor and how they're spaced, and the intricate reliefs on the upper level. Those reversed triangles to the right and left seem to be positioned in a very symbolic way, too. The proportions of the building are ideal, and the symbolic nature of the wall carvings all point to a very sophisticated concept of ordered space. In that sense, you could say that the Nunnery ranks with the Parthenon or the Doge's Palace in Venice. When I come to Mexico and look at the remains of the Mayan civilization here at Uxmal, especially the Nunnery on the eastern side, I'm always amazed by the level of refinement here. It must rank as one of the architectural masterpieces of all time. Yes, and all the conditions necessary to reach these heights were present here. Now, when I think back to the Jomon period, I can see how some of those unique shapes were created then as well, such as the earthenware vases shaped like the flames of a fire. But in Japan, this period was interrupted quite early on by influences from the mainland, so they didn't get as far as building magnificent monuments. But judging by the creative originality of those flame-shaped vases, if there hadn't been such an overwhelming influence from abroad in the 4th century BC, there's no knowing to what heights the Jomon culture would have risen. And I mean, I think all the evidence points in that direction. And that's the sort of thing that comes to mind when I'm here at Uxmal.
This flame-shaped Jomon earthenware vase was created at the height of the Jomon period. The image of the fiercely burning flames seems to be an apt symbol of the period itself. But do these strange shapes really represent flames? The earthenware in question was first discovered on New Year's Eve 1936 at the archaeological site of Umataka in Niigata Prefecture. Later on, many more of these vases were found here and along the banks of the Shinano River. Kozaburo Nakamura, one of the first discoverers of the pottery, told us an interesting story about the naming of the vases. The archaeologists Kondo, father and son. It was the father, Kanjiro, who gave the vase its name.
何と言えばいいのか表現する言葉がなかったわけなんですよね。で発掘された近藤徳三郎さんが私どもに土器のことを、初めはまだか土器とかなんとかって言ってましたけど、そのためにこう指を上げてこれが要するに炎であるか口のとこのねギザギザであるかとにかくこうした土器とこういう言葉をしばしば聞いてきたんですよ。それしか表現のあれがなかったんでしょうね。ところお父さん漢学者ですからねうまいこと言ってその火炎土器という言葉を言い出されていつとはなしにそれがまかり通る。
Now, because we call this the Kain flame-shaped vase, we take it for granted that the protrusions represent flames. But do they? If we take a close look at the vase, we notice that there are endless whirlpool patterns over the surface. We thought we'd go deeper and consult the scientist.
ここら辺なんかこうさざ波っていうんですかね、波のこういったような感じを表してですね。
この辺はこう波がね。
ここら辺は跳ねちゃってるような感じですね。
そうですね。ここにね、こういう渦が2つできる。それですね。流速が非常に遅い時に、物体の後ろにできる双子渦に大変似てると思うんですけど、ここにですね、2つまた渦がありますが、半時計方向の渦ですね。これはもう少し流速が速くなると物体の後ろにカルマン渦というのが普通できますね。それをなんかつなげたという感じが。
そうですね。ちょっと似てますね。
似てますね。
We decided to carry out a small experiment. If we gradually increase the flow of the water, we notice the appearance of what are known as twin vortexes. If we increase the speed even more, a number of new patterns take shape in the water. It's as though the water has come to life, twisting and twirling and undulating. And the Karman Vortex appears on both sides of the stream. If we join both gyrations, they form the letter S. This S shape, the protrusions rising at the top of the vase are said to really represent S-shaped vortexes. The Ware vase was excavated in the Suwa district of Nagano Prefecture in central Japan. It ranks with the flame-shaped vase as an example of Jomon culture at its zenith. The surface of this vase is filled in with countless curved lines, including S's and twin vortexes. So, what exactly do these endless whirls on the Jomon vase mean? We're back in Mexico at the Uxmal site. Unlike the Jomon civilization, the Mayans had a written language. The hieroglyphs carved on the buildings have been deciphered with the help of myths and other records. Did the Mayan and Jomon civilizations have any shapes in common? We talked to Mercedes de la Garza of the National Autonomous University of Mexico.
Este es más o menos el tipo de voluta, aunque hay otros tipos, otras formas. Pudiera ser simplemente una voluta simple. Este motivo representa agua por lo general, o sea, está asociado siempre a los dioses del agua, las lluvias, los ríos, los lagos, y tiene una relación muy directa con la serpiente, que es el símbolo de agua por excelencia en Mesoamérica.
Quetzalcoatl, the plumed serpent god. This god represented water, a fundamental source of energy. There are said to be many points of similarity between Quetzalcoatl and the dragon of Eastern mythology.
Bueno, para los mesoamericanos la naturaleza es una unidad que todo está impregnado de vida y de alma, de espíritus. No hacen distinciones entre plantas, animales, hombres, desde ese punto. O sea, todos tienen alma, todos pueden tener un poder, y hay algunos que son sagrados, hay algunos que son más fuertes, con más poder, con más espíritu, y son sagrados. Por ejemplo, los jaguares, las plantas alucinógenas, los rayos, el sol, pero todo está integrado y relacionado con la vida del hombre. O sea, el hombre depende de todas esas fuerzas.
This sketch of an old man sitting by the edge of the water is thought to be a self-portrait by Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci always stressed the importance of learning from nature. In his later years, he showed a special interest in the movements of water. He left these vivid sketches of twin vortexes and other complex patterns made by moving water. Da Vinci has succeeded in conveying the great energy of nature, such as flood and rainstorm, with these scientifically accurate sketches. Koshiki Island in Kagoshima Prefecture, southern Japan. They still celebrate a very old festival here. It's the day of the harvest moon. Very early in the morning, the men go into the hills to collect vines. The whole village gathers to help twist the vine into one long rope. The festival is known as Kazuramaki, or vine twining. At sunset, the festival gets going in earnest, and the men dance through the village with the long rope. By the time they reach the village square, the men are in a state of high excitement, and they dance with the rope in coiling, whirling patterns. This dance is said to represent the enormous strength of the life force. The people of both the Jomon period in Japan and the Mayan civilization in Central America were able to create marvelous shapes. Shuichi Kato thinks that this was due very much to the fact that these two civilizations were each isolated from the outside world. In an isolated civilization, there is a high possibility of artistic maturity, although little of technical development. Kato feels that it is very important to keep this point in mind when we look back on the history of Japanese art.
In Japan's Heian period, from the 9th to the 12th century AD, there was just a little interchange with the continental cultures of Asia. And during the Edo period, that's from the 17th to the mid-19th century, Japan was closed off from the outside world. Consequently, very few technological advances were made in those times. Most of us are familiar with the fact that the Heian period was a time of superb cultural and artistic achievements. Many of our traditions in the arts had their beginnings then. So the arts were taken to their highest point of refinement, but there wasn't much progress in technology. The same could be said for the Edo period.
In 894 AD, Japan severed all official ties with the Tang dynasty of China and consequently cut herself off from the cultures of China and other countries. During the 300 years that followed, the Japanese court flourished as the center of artistic expression. Based on the refined cultures of the Asian mainland that had been absorbed up until then, a genuine Japanese culture began to bloom. A uniquely Japanese stamp was put on works of literature, painting, calligraphy, architecture, and sculpture. From the 17th century to the mid-19th century, there was another period of isolation, when Japan cut herself off from all foreign influences. This was also a time when truly indigenous art and culture were born and developed. This period of isolation is probably best characterized by ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world. These are woodblock prints. The actual technology of printing remained very much the same, but from an artistic point of view, a number of innovations occurred. This contrast of unchanging techniques and progressive artistry was a product of an isolated age. The much earlier Jomon period is also thought to be an age when there was very little influence from the mainland countries. The actual craft of kneading the clay and forming pottery didn't change that much, but numerous variations were made in the shape and design. When there was no influence from outside, it's possible to see a logical flow in the changes that take place within a certain form. We can see this happening quite clearly with the flame-shaped Jomon ware. The protrusions at the top of the vase grew taller as the period progressed. And they reached a point where they were artistically most impressive. But after this, the protrusions became too exaggerated and the proportions of the vase were no longer balanced. The changes which took place in the flame-shaped Jomon ware are an excellent example of how the people of the Jomon age experimented with the shape and took it to its full potential. Around the 3rd or 2nd century BC, rice cultivation and metal tools were introduced to Japan from the Asian continent. A great technological revolution took place, but it also meant the end of Jomon civilization. In the New Age, earthenware pottery took on a more practical shape and lost its decorative element. How were the spirit and form of the Jomon period transcended to allow the emergence of the Japanese creative culture of the following periods? Let's look at Mexico again, conquered by Spain at the beginning of the 16th century. Until then, the Central American civilizations had managed to develop on their own, completely isolated from other countries. But this encounter with Europe spelt the end of these ancient cultures. The civilization of Central America, too, once disappeared in the wave of foreign culture. But suddenly, the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica reappeared in the 20th century in the form of a mural painting movement started in Mexico by David Alfaro Siqueiros. This revolution proved to be a turning point. This was when artists like Siqueiros, Rivera, and Orozco started a movement in Mexico to bring art to the people. They did this by painting huge murals in squares and other places where people gathered. This mural painting movement proved to have a big influence on modern art around the world. Towards the end of his life, Siqueiros built his Polyforum, which was destined to become one of the high points of the Mexican mural painting movement. It was completed in 1971. Polyforum, a word invented by Siqueiros, means multi-purpose, multi-form meeting place. The Great Hall can accommodate about 1,000 people, and it's filled with paintings and sculptures. It's the very epitome of the aims of the mural painting movement, a gathering place for the people. The Mexican mural painting movement has resurrected the traditions of the ancient Mesoamerican civilizations. A complete disregard for perspective. Hundreds of faces and groups represented on the same flat surface. But there is unity, because all these different figures represent an integral part of the universe. This was the form that existed before the Spanish invasion. In Mexico, the culture of the time of isolation has been revived today. Siqueiros has depicted the past and the future of the human race, letting the story be told as an allegory, starting with the sunrise and ending at sunset. By combining paintings, sculptures, and architecture in his Polyforum, Siqueiros has managed to realize his dream of resurrecting the temples of the ancient Mesoamerican civilizations.
In the case of Mexico, a very long Neolithic age flourished right until the Spanish invasion in the 16th century. And the Spanish cultural influence lasted for several hundred years too, until the artists of the Revolution, who introduced a completely different art form. In the case of Japan, it wasn't that long before the introduction of outside influences. The change from the New Stone Age to the Bronze Age was quite abrupt. And then, in the latter half of the 19th century, the techniques of Western painting were introduced to Japan. This illustrates the cultural dilemma in Japan. Rather like the Mexicans after the Spanish invasion, the Japanese from the late 19th century onwards have been agonizing as to how they can paint in oils in a uniquely Japanese way. But only 100 years have passed since this new shock, so it's really too much to expect Japanese artists to have reached the heights of Siqueiros and Orozco. It's not a matter of whether they're good painters or not. There are Japanese artists who have excellent technique. Within the progress of modern art around the world, people like Siqueiros in Mexico were able to produce a form that was unique to their country and their age. But we haven't seen this happening yet in Japan. Japanese artists have done some good, interesting paintings, but they still haven't managed to produce something that will make people stop and say, that is a work of art which could only have come from modern Japan.
Japanese creativity started with the versatile and powerful forms of the Jomon period. These forms continued to be developed and changed in the following periods. Then, under the impact particularly of Western culture and technology, in some ways Japanese art became detached from its roots. Today in Japan, the will to create remains as strong as ever. The spirit has not been lost. What has yet to bloom in full flower is the form.